Well, thanks, Dick. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually live in Southern California in Orange County, a little town called Seal Beach, named Mayberry by the Sea. I travel around quite a bit, making presentations and attending air shows across the country. I'll be out at Fagan Museum on Saturday, signing copies of my book. I'm also immediate past president of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association. And it's our mission, the association, to remember, to honor, and educate. To remember the air war over Europe, to honor the men who fought it, and to educate the public about it. Most of the people or groups that I speak to really don't know much about the air war over Europe or the 8th Air Force. Most of them have never seen a B-17, let alone been in one. And so my presentation is geared toward the general public. People who really don't know too much about the air war. The crowd today is quite a bit different than that. The people in this room know quite a bit about it. So take that into consideration during my presentation. Growing up, I knew the basics of my dad's World War II history. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. He flew bombing missions over occupied Europe and Germany. In February of 1944, he was shot down over Belgium. And he was missing in action for 7 months, but he evaded capture and able to get back to England. But it wasn't until I retired in 2009 that I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. And at that time, I had no intention at all of writing a book. I just wanted to go through all the material and items that my parents had kept from the war years and organize that and learn more. And there were two items that were most significant in the things that they had kept. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down, which was absolutely riveting. So much so that it was included in two books that were written, one in the 70s, the other in the 80s. One was called The 98th by Gerald Astor, about the 8th Air Force, who flew its first mission on August 17, 1942. Their goal was to hit military industrial targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. They got their nickname, the Mighty Eight, by noted historian Roger Freeman, because of the number of planes they could put up in the sky. It numbered into the hundreds. And on December 24th of 1944, 2,000 bombers hit Berlin. I get excited when I see one B-17 flying in the sky. I can't even imagine seeing that many. The other book was First Over Germany, written by Russell Strong, about the 306 bomb group that my dad was in. Russell Strong was a navigator in the 306 and became its historian after the war and formed the Historical Association. The 306 motto was First Over Germany because they were the first bomb group to hit a target in Germany on January 27, 1943. Also, they were the longest serving bomb group in the 8th Air Force. They arrived in England in September of 1942, and they didn't go back home until December of 1946. They stayed on after the war, involved with aerial photo mapping of Western Europe and Northern Africa. The other item that was of significance were all the letters that my dad had written to my mother during the war. And reading those letters was absolutely fascinating. My dad was quite candid in what he wrote in those letters. He talked about bombing missions, talked about what life was like on the base, what life was like in England and London at the time, escapades of his crew. And I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe. I spent countless hours on the internet doing research, downloading declassified military documents. I started joining World War II organizations, going to reunions, listening to veterans tell their stories. Then finally, 3 years later, in 2012, I came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that people needed to read about it and know about it, so I decided to write a book. It took me 4.5 years from the time that I started my research to the time the book was published, 12 months to actually publish the book. I formed my own publishing company, actually, to publish the book, Seabreeze Publishing, LLC, which is the name of the street that I live on in Seal Beach. And I contract with independent professionals for all the associated services. And it was finally released in August of 2014. Since that time, it's won 25 National Book Awards, and it's in the museums, most all the air museums across the United States, which I'm quite proud of. But I probably wouldn't have written the book if it hadn't have been for two Belgian gentlemen. In the upper left corner, you see my dad on the left with Dr. Paul Callahan. That picture was taken in 1994 at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, and my dad's plane going down. And then in the lower right-hand corner, pictured with me in 2014 at the 70th anniversary is Jacques Below. These two men were young boys during the war. They were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis against their family and friends. And they became local historians later in life, and they interviewed Belgian citizens and members of the Belgium Underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew. And they documented their testimony, and they gave me unbelievably detailed information that's in the book about events that took place so long ago that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe them a great deal. And the story of my dad and his crew is all based on first-hand testimony here by members of the crew, Belgium, and the members of the Belgium Underground, or declassified military documents. Initially, my dad didn't go into the Air Force as a result of the first peacetime draft implemented in U.S. history by President Franklin Roosevelt in the fall of 1940. My dad went into the Army in April of 1941, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at the time, the U.S. military was woefully weak. They ranked 18th in the world in military strength behind Romania. Also, they were very ill equipped, as you can tell by the World War I vintage uniform that my dad is wearing in this picture. 3 months later, in July, my dad married Ruth Hempel at First Lutheran Church in Pasadena, California. My mother was born and raised in California. My dad was actually born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and moved to California with his family when he was 13. A few months later, on December 7th of 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was at war. Well, my mother was quite afraid at this time about the uncertain future, so she went up to Washington over Christmas to visit my dad. And 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born. Well, my dad was feeling a little pressure at the time. Here he had a new bride, a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could support her very well on private's pay in the Army, so he decided to volunteer for the Air Force. So in June of 1943, he went through pre-flight training in Santa Ana, California, 1942, and then went through the various stages of pilot training. The slide's a little busy, but outlines the various stages of pilot training. First was primary training that my dad took at Santa Maria, California. And it was tough getting through pilot training. 40% of the guys that entered didn't make it through pilot training. After primary, then they went on to basic. And after basic, they went to advanced training, the third stage. And it was in basic, before they went into advanced training, that they separated the pilots out. Some either went into single-engine planes, fighters, or pilots went into two-engine planes, transports or bombers. Typically, the shorter pilots went into fighters, but I also think it was based on personality. To me, those fighter pilots tended to be more independent, kind of cocky, big egos, risk takers, whereas the bomber pilots tended to be a little more level-headed and team players, be that as it may. Here you see a proud moment for my dad. This was in primary training right after he soloed, and at the time you couldn't wear your goggles on top of your helmet unless you had soloed. So this was a proud moment for him in Santa Maria. You can see he's smoking. I think all the guys pretty much smoked back then. These are the three planes that he flew in pilot training. In primary training, up on top he flew a Stearman biplane, and in basic training, single-wing Vultee Valiant. And then in advanced training, a twin-engine Curtiss-Wright AT-9. He graduated from advanced pilot training in April of 1943 at Douglas, Arizona, where he received his commission as a second lieutenant in his pilot wings. And from there he went on to transitional training, where he learned how to fly a 4-engine B-17 bomber, and then went on to operational crew training, where the various members of the team came together and they learned to operate as a unit. And once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. On October 21st of 1943, he and his crew, were reported to the 306 Bomb Group at Thurlow, England. It's about 60 miles north, a little west of London. This is what the base looked like back then. It's no longer there, but there's a nice little museum there now. Here you see the insignia of the 306 Bomb Group, the Triangle H. There were 3 air divisions in the 8th Air Force. The 306 was in the 1st Air Division, signified by the triangle, and then their other designation of their bomb group and base was the H. A lot of you have seen the movie 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. Well, that was a story based on a true story about the 306 bomb group. The fictitious bomb group in the movie, the 9/18th, was derived by multiplying this 306 by 3. Another distinction of the 306 bomb group is that their flight surgeon, Dr. Thurman Schuler, was responsible for convincing 8th Bomber Command Ira Ecker to implement a mission limit. The morale was really going into the tank with these combat crews because they knew they never were going to make it through the war. They were either going to be killed or shot down and become a POW. Schuler initially proposed a mission limit of 20, but Aker decided on 25, and then when Jimmy Doolittle became commander of the 8th in 1944, he raised it to 30 and then 35. Like all bomb groups, the 306 had 4 bomb squadrons up in the upper left, the 367th Clay Pigeon, so named by a journalist because of the horrific losses they took during the war. I believe that the 367th Squadron took more losses than any other bomb squadron in the 8th Air Force. Then you have the Eager Beavers, the Grim Reapers, and in the lower right-hand corner, my dad's squadron, 369 Fighting Titan. I always like to point out the ground crew. The combat crews got all the glory and the recognition, but these ground crews really kept these planes flying. They stayed up all night after missions, trying to get these bombers ready to go back out again, often in very inclement weather, doing repairs on the plane, battle damage, maintenance, getting them armed to go back out. And they really considered these planes their plane. They just loaned them out to the combat crews occasionally to fly. They took great pride in keeping their planes ready. So they were really the unsung heroes. Here you see my dad's crew. A B-17 had a 10-man crew. There were 4 officers who were dealing in front. My dad is in the lower left. He was the first pilot and as such the commander of the plane and the crew. And then beside him the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. And then you have 6 enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, who were mainly gunners. 5 of these men came back home, 5 of them did not. That is not the Susan Ruth, that's the plane. That was just a B-17 that they took a crew picture in front of when they arrived in England. I always like to point out the nose art on the plane. I love the nose art. It's interesting that the Air Force was the only entity that allowed their planes to be painted. The Marines didn't, the Navy didn't, nor did other countries. But the Air Force thought it would help the morale of these young guys if they could name and paint their planes. And they were very creative in what they named and painted their planes. Many times it was a cartoon character, but more often than not, it was a scantily clad or nude woman. After all, these guys were in their late teens and early 20s and virile young men. The 306 bomb group flew B-17s. It was nicknamed the Flying Fortress because of the armament on the plane. There were 12 to 13 50 caliber machine guns that could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. Also, they could take a tremendous amount of battle damage and keep flying. There were actually 3 different B-17 models flown in the European theater. At the beginning was the E model, but there were only about 500 of those made, and they were quickly phased out by the F model. And then they were replaced in the fall of 1943 by really the definitive B-17, the G model, which you can always tell by the chin turret under the nose of the plane. Each plane has tail markings to identify them. Here again you see the Triangle H of the 1st Air Division and the 306 Bomb Group. And then each plane had an identification number on the tail that was assigned by the manufacturer. Boeing designed and produced 64% of the B-17s, but the Douglas Aircraft Company and Lockheed Vega also each produced 18% of the B-17s. Here you see the crew positions on the plane and the nose. Again, this is the G model with the chin turret. And the nose, you have the bombardier, and behind him, the navigator of him, the two pilots, the flight engineer, then you have the bomb bay, the radio operator, ball turret gunner, two waist gunners, and then the tail gunner. The bombs hung in racks in the bomb bay. This is a little difficult to see on either side of the plane, and it was very cramped in there. That catwalk's only 8 inches wide, and that boy's only 8 years old, so you can see how tight it is in there. And it wasn't uncommon for bombs to get hung up on those racks occasionally, which required one of the crewmen to get a wrench and knock it loose or kick it loose with his foot. And I can't even imagine what that must have been like, because when those bomb bay doors are open, they're looking 5 miles straight down to the earth, and that wind howling all around. It took a lot of courage to do that. Here you see the crew positions a little more clearly. This is the F model without the chin turret. Again, in the plexiglass nose, you have the bombardier, who main function was dropping the bombs accurately, but in the G model, he manned the chin turret. And behind him was a navigator who needed to know where they were going and where they were under attack. He manned the cheat guns, and above them were the two pilots, the first pilot on the left and the co-pilot on the right. And you needed two pilots to fly these planes, not just because if one got killed or was injured, you had another pilot. But you needed to share the duties of flying this plane. Back then, you really had to fly planes. It wasn't like today with computers. These missions lasted 6 to 10 hours, so it was very tedious and strenuous, both mentally and physically. It took a lot of muscle to fly these planes. Also, they flew in tight formation, so they had to stay alert at all times, or they could clip a wing next to the plane next to them, or run into a plane in front of them and go down. Plus, they had to continually fight the current, the turbulence. You had the normal air turbulence of weather, but they also had the turbulence of all those B-17s being in such close proximity to one another in these tight formations, so that the wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air. So they really had to struggle flying these planes to keep in formation and not hit another plane. Behind the pilots, you had, excuse me, get ahead of myself here again. Above the pilots, you had the flight engineer, but he also manned the top turret under attack. And he was the onboard mechanic, also called the crew chief, and he knew how all the systems worked in the plane, and he also helped monitor all the instruments. There were over 150 gauges, toggles, dials, and switches in the cockpit, and he peered over the pilot's shoulders to help monitor engine performance and fuel consumption. Then behind the bomb bay, you have the radio operator, which is the most comfortable position in the plane. He had a relatively roomy compartment and a chair to sit at. And then below him was the most cramped position in the plane, the ball turret gunner. Again, these missions lasted 6 to 10 hours, and this guy was in a fetal position for lengthy periods at a time. Had to be really uncomfortable. And above the ball, you have the two waist gunners, which was the most exposed positions on the plane, and then another cramped position, the tail gunner. My dad flew his first combat mission on November 3rd of 1943. And flying combat was brutal and extremely dangerous. 26,000 men died in the 8th Air Force. That's more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Another 28,000 became POWs after their planes were knocked out of the sky by enemy fighters or flak. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military during World War II. To begin with, you had all these bombers taken off from these bases on the day of a mission. There were at the peak, there were 40 bomb groups in the 8th Air Force in and around East Anglia, about the size of Vermont. So on the day of a mission, you had hundreds of bombers taken off. And back then, there was no air traffic control, there was no radar, everything was based on visual sight. And usually the weather was socked in and overcast in England, and they couldn't see anything until they got above the cloud layer. And then they had to form up. Individual planes formed up into 3-plane elements. Elements formed up into bomb squadrons. Squadrons formed up into bomb groups. Bomb groups formed up into combat wings. Combat wings formed up into air divisions. And this assembling all took between an hour and 2 hours before they even could head across the channel to begin the mission. Then they had to deal with the elements. These planes weren't pressurized, so above 10,000 feet they had to go on oxygen, or else they'd pass out in a couple minutes and soon die. Also, it was extremely cold at this altitude. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero, so frostbite was a huge problem, and many airmen were hospitalized for lengthy periods of time with serious frostbite injuries. Here you see the waist gunner with their combat uniform. He has this steel helmet and his tinted goggles because of the brightness of the altitude at the sky at that altitude. Oxygen mask, his flak jacket that was apron with metal plates in the front and the back to help protect them, and a fleece-lined jacket and pants, thermal boots, and gloves. And you see the little, let's see if I can work. Let's hear this, the white strap here, that's his parachute harness. They didn't actually wear their parachutes in the plane because it was too cramped. It was more cramped than a B-17 than a submarine. If they needed to bail out, they needed to have their wits about them to find their parachute, clip it on hooks on the back of the harness, and then bail out of the plane. The next thing they had to deal with was enemy fighters. The Germans had radar stations set up along the continental coast of Europe, so they knew when these bomber formations were coming, and they'd send up their Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to intercept them. Here you see the waist gunner in his flak jacket and goggles, firing his 50 caliber machine gun, and all those spent cartridges on the ground. The ammunition came in belts, as you can see one kind of hanging down there, which were 27 feet long. So if the gunner fired the whole belt, they said he fired the whole 9 yards, and that's where that came from. It was 8th Bombers Command belief at the beginning of the war that these bombers flying, heavily armed bombers flying in formations of hundreds of bombers could defend themselves. They didn't need fighter escorts. And they flew in what was called the combat box formation. This is the box of a combat wing. And then within the box of the wing, you have 3 boxes representing bomb groups. And then within each box of the bomb group, you had 3 bomb squadrons. So the theory was all this interlacing firepower could ward off the German fighters. Here you see the formation of another angle. You have the from on top, from the side, with a 3-dimensional formation, and from behind. Unfortunately, 8th Bomber Command was badly mistaken that these bomber formations could defend themselves. During the early years of the war in 1942, especially in 1943, the 8th Air Force took devastating losses. Even though they implemented a 25 mission limit in the spring of '43, it was statistically impossible for a combat crewman to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown before being shot down was only 6. And even when they did give formations fire escorts to begin with, they couldn't follow these formations deep into Germany. They could make it across the channel into occupied Europe, but then they'd have to turn around because of low fuel and head back to England. Well, the Luftwaffe would just wait until these the U.S. fighters would return back home, and they'd go up and intercept the formations. It really wasn't until the end of '43, or really the beginning of '44, when the P-47 Thunderbolts got external fuel tanks added to them, and the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, that the bomber formation finally had adequate fighter support to and from the target. The P-51 Mustangs were particularly effective. The next thing the formation had to deal with was anti-aircraft fire. Here you see a flak gun. Flak is the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And these were deadly weapons. They could fire 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that these bombers were flying. And these shells were filled with different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal that would burst out hundreds of feet and could easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. That skin was so thin that you could take a screwdriver and just pull it right through it. From a distance, these shells exploding looked like small innocent black puffs, but once these formations got amongst them, the noise got louder. The flashes got brighter, and if one exploded near the ship, it would just violently rock the ship. My dad said even though it was so cold at that altitude, he would be perspiring profusely and be wringing wet from the adrenaline running through his body as they entered this killing field. When the formation reached a pre-designated point near the target, called the initial point of the IP, they started their bomb run. And at that time, the first pilot gave control of the plane to the bombardier, who flew the plane through the northern bomb site. It was connected into the autopilot of the plane. It was an analog computer, very advanced for its time. They could calculate various factors such as the speed of the plane, wind speed, altitude, etc. So they could drop the bombs accurately. Here you see the bombardier looking through the crosshairs of the northern bomb site. And once the bombs were released, he would yell, "Bombs away!" And that would signal the first pilot to take control over the plane. And then he'd make a big swinging curve to get the heck out of there and go to another pre-designated point called a rally point, where these bombers that made it through the bomb run would try to form up and head back to England. It was on a bomb run to Frankfurt on November 8th of 1944. I got deleted there. When my dad's plane dropped their bombs successfully, but their bomb bay doors got hit by flak and they couldn't get them back up. And as a result, they caused a drag in the plane. They lost airspeed and they lagged behind the formation. And they were singled out by two Focke-Wulf German fighters. And in the ensuing air battle, the Susan Ruth was shot down. Two of the crew members were killed in the plane. The other 8 were able to bail out. But both those Focke-Wulf fighters were shot down as well. One piloted by Siegfried Merrick crashed and he was killed in the plane. And the other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out. He made it through the war. When I was doing my research, one day my wife casually asked me, "Well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane?" Which I thought was a ridiculous idea. How in the world am I ever going to do that? But lo and behold, I found Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, he became a translator after the war, so he speaks English. And he gave me some wonderful insight about what it was like to go up against the 8th Air Force that's in the book. After my dad bailed out, he came down in some trees just in Belgium, just north of the French border. And this was a picture that was taken by a Belgian gentleman sent to my dad. There's over 200 time period photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything you're reading about. They were most of them were either sent to my dad from his Belgian helpers or from those two gentlemen that I mentioned earlier, Jacques Below or Paul Delahaye. His parachute got hung up on those trees and he couldn't get down. He was dangling 20 feet off the ground. Fortunately for him, a couple of young Belgian farmers came to his rescue before the Germans got to him. They went back to the farmhouse, got a ladder and a rope, and they helped him down this tree. That's Henri Franken. That's one of the Belgian men that helped my dad down the tree. This occurred around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so they told him to stay put and hide because they thought it was too dangerous for him to try to move him during the daylight. But they came back that night and they took him to this farmhouse. It was the farmhouse of the other Belgian gentleman, Raymond Dorvan. And that house is in Belgium, but those trees are in France, so you can tell it's really right on the border. He only stayed there one night because they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there any longer than that when those German patrols come in the area. So that evening, the Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilqueen, came in a tandem bike to take him to another location. That was the middle of the night, it was raining. They headed out on the bike. My dad could only pedal with one leg because he had shrapnel wounds in his other leg from those anti-aircraft shells exploding. And they came to a hill and they couldn't pedal anymore up the hill to get the bike up the hill, so I started pushing it. When they got to the top of the hill, they came to a cafe, a cabaret, and the lights were on, people were laughing, talking loudly, music was playing, and all of a sudden 2 German officers with their arms around young girls come walking out, and one of them puts his arm around my dad and asks for a light for a cigarette. Well, my dad was petrified. He couldn't speak French or German at the time, but fortunately Paul Tilqueen could. He lit the guy's cigarette and they let him go on their way. My dad said they were too drunk and probably too interested in these girls to pay too much attention to a couple of guys pushing a bike up a hill in the rain. After that, they moved my dad around from place to place. You might stay one night at one house or 6 weeks at another house. It all depended on how brave the people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgian underground thought it was for him to stay there. Here he's with two of his helpers. On the left is Ghislaine Bayou. It was with her and her husband Maurice that my dad wrote his diary, and the other woman is Jeanette Guedin. Her husband was actually a captain in the French army and was captured when Germany first invaded in 1940, and he spent the remainder of the war as a POW. He became quite close with these two families and stayed in touch with them after the war. And the people that hid my dad, or any down airmen for that matter, were unbelievably brave individuals. So they risked their lives and the lives of their friends and family by aiding these down airmen. If they were caught by the Gestapo, the secret German police, they'd be arrested, tortured, either shot or sent to concentration camps. And some of the helpers did meet that fate. Normally, when the underground came across down airmen, they tried to get them back through get them back to England through various escape routes, down through France, over the Pyrenees, in neutral Spain, and then out through British-controlled Gibraltar. But something always went wrong trying to get my dad out. And that must have been very stressful. First of all, his plane's attacked, on fire, has to bail out, comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, can't communicate with the military, doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the crew. He's dealing with these foreign people, Belgian people that he doesn't know, can't speak the language. Any one of them might be a collaborator and turn him over to the Gestapo. And when he's in hiding at any time of the day or night, the Gestapo could break in and arrest him and either send him to a POW camp or shoot him. So finally, he got tired of hiding. I guess he decided he wanted to get back into the fight. And he did have that year's experience of fighting on the ground, being in the infantry. So he joined the French resistance called the Maquis. And the Maquis was made up of independent small guerrilla groups spread throughout France. Their job was to harass the Germans. They would get their instructions from the British over coded messages through the BBC, and they were supplied by airdrops that the BBC would make. This is in my dad's group, just an example. There were about 20 guys in his group, led by a French lieutenant who had escaped from a POW camp. There were some Belgians, Frenchmen, and my dad sent some Algerians who were vicious fighters. This is a farmhouse where they stayed for a while, and just across the border in France. On one occasion, my dad was in those upper rooms early one morning, just in his skivvies with shaving cream on his face, and a German patrol came up the road. He had to jump out the window and hightail it into the woods to avoid being captured. And in the book, there's various encounters that are described about the Maquis group attacking German convoys. Also, several close calls my dad had of being discovered by the Gestapo when he was in hiding. Next picture is pretty amazing. Who took it? Now I got back to my dad. We'll never know, but that's my dad in front, jumping out of a Jeep with the Maquis of the French resistance. Finally, 7 months after he was shot down on September 2nd, 1944, word came that there were U.S. troops in a little nearby village of Prelong, France. My dad went over to the town square, went up to an army major, it was actually Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day, identified himself, and then made it back to England from Paris. Belgium's a unique little country. It's divided in two. The northern half is called Flanders, where they speak Dutch, and it's rather industrial. And the lower half is called Wallonius, where they speak French, and it's very rural, all farmland. And my dad and his crew, they were shot down right around in here at the French border. Actually, my dad and the plane both came down in Belgium, and the other guys that were able to bail out came down in France. And my dad, he spent part of the time hiding in Charleroi, and then that French farmhouse where the Maquis stayed, and Trelong, where he was liberated by the U.S. Army, down around here. The Belgian people are wonderful people. To this day, they are still so grateful and so thankful for the Allies coming to rescue them from Nazi oppression. And they do a great job of educating the younger people about the importance of that as well. They erected a number of memorials in the area on the anniversary of the events that took place there. They have celebrations, and their big celebration is around the Liberation Day of September 2nd. each year. And they, this is the poster from 2014 at the 70th anniversary. They last several days long, and they erect these big tents. This is just part of one, where they can seat hundreds of people, and they have lunches and dinners and band concerts and dances. All the local people, or the helpers, I should say, the volunteers dress up in period costumes. The local beer Chimay just flows, and everyone has a grand time. They have ceremonies at various memorials in the area. This is at Cendron, which is right at the French-Belgian border, where the 9th U.S. Infantry first crossed over the Wartoise River from France into Belgium to liberate the country. All the local villagers come out, all the dignitaries make speeches. The U.S. military is there, Belgian military, French military. Again, you can see the children and young people in front there, emphasizing the importance of these events. They also have a ceremony at the memorial that they erected to my dad and his crew at Mackinac, Belgium. And like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war until this memorial was erected in 1989. He and the 3 other crew members who were still living at the time went over for the dedication. And there my dad was reunited with lots of those Belgian people that hit him during the war and saw the places where he had been hit. And that brought it all back, and he started talking about it after then. And then in 1994, I went over to Belgium with my parents. And that's when it became personal for me, since I saw these places as well. I've been to Belgium 4 times, going for a 5th next year. And on my last trip, 2 years ago, I went to Munich, Germany, to visit Hans Berger. Hans is 94 years old now, lives in Munich, Germany, and we've become friends. He shot down 7 or 8 aircraft during his time as a Luftwaffe pilot. He shot down 7 B-17s and 1 Spitfire. Here you see my dad and me at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. This picture was taken in 2004. He wanted to see the memorial before he died. And we went, I accompanied him on a reunion to the Air Force Escape and Evasion Society, where we visited the memorial right before its official dedication. And that was the last trip my dad ever took. He wasn't the last crew member to die, but he was the oldest to die at 91 years old. And all the World War II veterans are in their 90s today. At the end of the war, there were 16 million World War II veterans. Less than 4% of those great men are still with us. There's no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of the United States and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom, without doubt, the greatest generation. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten, and it is our duty to remember. Thank you. Yes, if anybody had any questions, I'd glad to field some. Yes, sir.
The other 4 members of the crew, did they become POWs or?
As I mentioned, 5 made it back home, 5 did not.
But
3 of them did become POWs.
So they were POWs until the end of the war then, right?
Well, one of them he was involved in the 86-day Black March through Germany. 2 others were so badly wounded that they were repatriated.
Oh, really?
Right. But to get all the details, you have to read the book, which I have for sale back here if you'd like to buy one. They're $25 cash or credit card. There's something different. The book's just not about my dad. It's about what happened to each member of the crew.
Did your dad have any relationship with the military after he got out after the end of the war?
Became a air traffic controller. Well, when he came back home, he was a flight instructor for a while, and then he was air traffic control operator for a while. And then he got out of the service. He did not stay in. My other sister, Nancy, she was born while he was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mother, having a 1-year-old daughter, an infant daughter, and then not knowing whether her husband was ever going to come home.
After the war, did your dad have an experience with the crew at the reunion?
Yeah, of the 5 that made it back, they would get together now and then. I met them when I was small, but, you know, didn't know anything back then. You know, that my parents would have me come in and meet Mr. and Mrs. Musial or say hello, and I'd say hello, shake their hand, and go back to my room. You know, and now in hindsight, I wish I had talked to them more. But they did get together now and then. Yes, sir.
I got to brag a little bit here when you talked about the northern bombsight. The northern bombsights were made by General Mills 7 crow miles from where we sit. 90,000 of them.
Yeah, it was a highly secretive device, but the Germans knew all about it because they had a spy, Hermann Lang, in the Northern Bombsight factory, who gave all the specifications to the Germans. He was later arrested, spent 18 years in prison, but the Germans knew all about it. One thing I'd like to point out that most people don't realize, after my dad made it back to England, the Air Force had a rule you couldn't fly again if you were shot down over occupied territory and aided by the underground, because they were worried if you flew in combat again and were shot down a second time and captured by the Germans and tortured, that you give up the identity of those people that helped you the first time. The only exception that I know of to that was Chuck Yeager, who personally met with General Eisenhower and talked to him into going back into combat. So that's why my dad was sent home and then became a flight instructor. Again, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with giving a presentation to the guys that were actually there at the time and lived it. So, you know, I thank you for your service.